Welcome back to. In our ongoing examination of the human condition, we often find ourselves drawn to the places where love and greed intersect. These are the most volatile and dangerous of crossroads, where sacred vows can become death sentences and the promise of "till death do us part" is treated not as a pledge to be honored, but as a chillingly pragmatic deadline to be met. Before we delve into a world of whirlwind romance, staggering, almost unimaginable wealth, and the coldest, most calculated of betrayals, I invite you to join our dedicated community of truth seekers. If you are compelled by stories that peel back the carefully constructed masks people wear to reveal the monstrous ambitions that often writhe just beneath the surface, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Your support is the lifeblood that allows us to continue bringing these hidden, often terrifying, stories into the full, unflinching light of day. Tonight, we attend a wedding, a celebration of what appears to be a modern-day fairy tale romance. But we will soon find ourselves at the center of a murder investigation where the grieving, beautiful, newlywed bride is the prime suspect. The key to unlocking her dark and meticulously guarded secret lies not in a bloody weapon or a stray fingerprint, but in the elegant, looping, and ultimately, fatally flawed signature on a single sheet of paper. The wedding of Alexander Sterling and Isabella Dubois was the kind of event that existed only in the glossy, heavily curated pages of high society magazines and in the fevered dreams of ambitious social climbers. It was not merely a wedding. It was a symphony of tasteful, almost oppressive opulence, held at the Sterling family's sprawling, ancestral estate in the heart of the countryside. It was a place of ancient, silent oaks and rolling, emerald green hills that seemed to exist in a different, more golden, and altogether more perfect century. Alexander Sterling, at the relatively young age of 38, was the reluctant, almost accidental king of the new digital age. A quiet, unassuming, and intensely private genius, he had built his company, Nexus AI, from a chaotic dorm room project into a global behemoth that had fundamentally and irrevocably reshaped the world. He possessed a staggering, almost incomprehensible fortune, but he wore it with an air of profound, awkward discomfort, like a borrowed, ill-fitting suit. He was a man far more comfortable with the clean, elegant logic of lines of code than with the messy, unpredictable complexities of the human heart. This well-known fact made his whirlwind, 6-month romance and subsequent marriage to the impossibly beautiful and enigmatic Isabella Dubois all the more shocking and suspect to those who knew him best. Isabella was, by all accounts, a living work of art, an art curator by trade, a profession that seemed perfectly suited to her own aesthetic perfection. She moved through the world with a serene, almost regal grace. She was possessed of a classic, cool, almost untouchable beauty, with hair the color of raven feathers, eyes the color of deep emeralds, and a voice that was a low, melodic, and utterly captivating purr. She was sophisticated, intelligent, well-read, and she seemed to adore the shy, brilliant Alexander with a fierce, protective passion that was both touching and, to some, a little too perfect. She was, by all accounts, the flawless answer to the lonely billionaire's prayers. Almost all accounts. Clara Sterling, Alexander's older sister by 5 years and his only living relative, watched the ceremony from the front pew of the private chapel on the estate grounds, a knot of cold, hard dread tightening in the pit of her stomach. A sharp, pragmatic, and highly respected corporate lawyer who had helped her younger brother navigate the treacherous, shark-infested waters of his business empire, Clara saw Isabella not as a dream come true, but as a perfectly executed, long-term business plan. She had watched, with a growing sense of alarm, as this woman had appeared out of nowhere, had utterly captivated her lonely, work-obsessed brother, and had rushed him to the altar in less than 6 months. Clara's extensive and expensive private background checks on the woman who called herself Isabella Dubois had come back curiously, unervingly blank. It was a curated void, a life with no discernible family, no long-term childhood friends, no awkward college photos. Her professional history seemed to begin, fully formed and impressively credentialed, only 5 years prior. But Alexander, so brilliant in matters of logic and data, was blinded by a love he had long believed he would never find. He had dismissed his sister's well-founded concerns as the overprotective, cynical ramblings of a woman who didn't understand, and perhaps even resented, the very concept of romance. As Alexander and Isabella exchanged their vows under a massive, breathtaking canopy of white roses, his voice was thick with a genuine, unadulterated emotion that brought tears to the eyes of the guests. Hers, in contrast, was a smooth, flawless, and perfectly modulated recitation. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp, late autumn air that drifted through the open chapel doors. She was not witnessing a holy matrimony. She was certain, witnessing a hostile takeover of the highest, most personal order. The honeymoon was a blissful, 2-week blur of private jets, secluded, white sand Tahitian beaches, and a series of Instagram-perfect moments that Isabella meticulously and artfully documented for their adoring public. They returned to their new life in Alexander's stunning, minimalist penthouse apartment, a veritable palace of glass and steel that occupied the top 3 floors of the city's most exclusive residential tower. For 3 glorious months, they were the city's golden couple, their every move chronicled by a fascinated and fawning press. Alexander, for the first time in his adult life, seemed truly, profoundly happy. He was more relaxed, more present, his workaholic tendencies softened by the clear, calming influence of his new wife. Isabella, for her part, played the role of the perfect corporate wife to absolute perfection. She hosted elegant, influential dinner parties, effortlessly charmed his most difficult business associates, and managed their complex domestic life with a graceful, almost invisible efficiency. The end of the fairy tale came on a Tuesday night, exactly 100 days after their wedding. The first call, at 11:32 p.m., went to Clara. It was Isabella, her voice a raw, hysterical, almost inhuman shriek, a sound so utterly alien from her usual composed, melodic murmur that Clara initially didn't recognize it. "Clara, it's Alexander. Something's terribly wrong. He's not breathing. I don't know what happened. The ambulance is on its way, but, oh God. Clara, please hurry." Clara arrived at the penthouse, her heart a cold, hard hammer in her chest, to a scene of controlled, almost surreal chaos. Paramedics were working frantically on Alexander, who lay still, pale, and utterly lifeless on the plush, snow-white rug of their cavernous living room. Isabella was a crumpled heap of designer silk and raw, theatrical grief, being comforted by a stoic-looking police officer who seemed overwhelmed by the sheer, opulent scale of the apartment. A grim-faced, exhausted-looking paramedic approached Clara a few moments later, his words a death knell that echoed in the vast, silent, and suddenly tomb-like space. "I'm so sorry, Miss Sterling. We did everything we could. We've lost him." Detective Kaito Tanaka arrived on what he was told was a routine, if high-profile, unattended death of a major public figure. At 52, Tanaka was a man of quiet, almost monastic patience and observation. He was a homicide detective of the old school, a man who believed that every crime scene, every object, every person told a story, and it was his job to listen with an almost religious focus to the whispers that others, in their rush to find a simple answer, so often missed. His partner, Detective Lena Petrova, was his perfect foil, younger, more intuitive, with a keen, almost unsettling understanding of the psychological nuances of a crime, the dark, emotional currents that flowed beneath the surface of events. As they surveyed the scene, everything seemed to point to a tragic, natural, and ultimately uncomplicated event. The penthouse was immaculate, a testament to Isabella's perfect taste and order. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no signs of forced entry. Isabella, now heavily sedated by her private physician and wrapped in a cashmere blanket, recounted a simple, heartbreaking story through her sobs. Alexander had complained of sharp chest pains after dinner. He had a well-documented history of high stress from his work. He had collapsed suddenly, without warning, while they were having a quiet nightcap. The preliminary report from the medical examiner on the scene supported her account. The likely cause of death was a massive coronary event, a sudden, catastrophic heart attack. Given Alexander Sterling's high-pressure, high-stakes lifestyle, it was tragic, it was shocking, But it was not, in the end, altogether unbelievable. The case seemed destined to be closed before it was even truly opened, a sad footnote in the life of a great man. But then, Tanaka and Petrova spoke with Clara Sterling. She had refused sedation, and she stood in the corner of the vast living room like a pillar of controlled, icy fury and profound grief. Her lawyerly composure was a stark, almost accusatory contrast to Isabella's histrionic, almost performative sorrow. "A heart attack?" Clara said, her voice dripping with a cold, corrosive disbelief that cut through the somber atmosphere of the room. "My brother did not have a heart attack. Alexander had the physical condition of an Olympic athlete. He had a full, top-to-bottom medical workup 6 weeks ago for his life insurance policy. I might add that he took out at her insistence. He passed with flying colors. He ate a macrobiotic diet prepared by a private chef. He didn't smoke. He barely drank. He had a personal trainer. Men like my brother, men in his physical condition, don't just drop dead, detective." "What are you suggesting, Ms. Sterling?" Petrova asked gently, her voice soft but her eyes sharp and observant. Clara's gaze shifted to the other side of the room, where Isabella was being tended to by a flock of concerned friends and a private doctor. Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated venom. "I am suggesting," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that was more menacing than any shout, "that you look at her. You look at the woman who swept into his life like a perfect, beautiful storm, married him in a blink of an eye, and is now the sole heir to a $12 billion fortune. Do not close this case, detective. Not until you have torn her perfect, fabricated life apart, piece by bloody piece." The raw, primal vehemence of Clara's accusation was a stone dropped into the placid, officially calm waters of the investigation. Tanaka, a man who trusted a grieving sister's cold, logical rage far more than a new bride's theatrical tears, felt the first, familiar tingle of professional doubt, the whisper that told him he was standing on the edge of a very deep, very dark, and very cold abyss. The official cause of death might be a heart attack, but the stench of motive in this palace in the sky was thick, suffocating, and undeniable. He made a decision, one that would put him at odds with his superiors and the city's powerful elite who wanted this sad, unfortunate story to fade away as quickly and quietly as possible. He ordered a full, comprehensive, and unusually extensive toxicology screen on Alexander Sterling's body, and he quietly, officially, kept the case file open. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the glittering, indifferent city below. He was now investigating not a tragic accident, but a potential murder. His prime suspect was beautiful, intelligent, and, as of a few hours ago, the wealthiest and most powerful widow in the world. The story of Alexander and Isabella, he was now sure, was not a fairy tale that had ended in tragedy. It was a perfectly executed plan that had just reached its horrifying and incredibly lucrative conclusion. The days following Alexander Sterling's death were a masterclass in the public performance of grief, with his beautiful widow, Isabella, in the starring role. Dressed in a series of exquisitely tailored black ensembles from the world's top designers, she was the very picture of tragic, shattered beauty. She moved through the whirlwind of preparations for the high-profile funeral like a ghost, her every public appearance a carefully choreographed and flawlessly executed display of profound sorrow and quiet, unshakable dignity. She granted a single, exclusive and tearful interview to a major news network, speaking in a soft, broken voice of her soulmate, their tragically, cruelly short time together, and her solemn vow to uphold his monumental legacy of innovation and philanthropy. The world, for the most part, was captivated, seeing her as the heartbroken, tragic heroine of a modern-day love story. But behind the scenes, far from the sympathetic gaze of the cameras, a different kind of drama was beginning to unfold, a drama of suspicion, legal maneuvering, and forensic science that would, step by painstaking step, begin to unravel the very fabric of her carefully constructed and utterly convincing lie. The first official tremor that threatened to bring down her entire edifice of deception came 2 weeks after the funeral. The setting was the stuffy, mahogany-paneled main boardroom of the Sterling family's longtime and intensely loyal legal firm. Arthur Kensington, a man in his late 70s with a mind as sharp as a razor and an unwavering, almost paternal loyalty to the Sterling family, had convened a private, somber meeting to read Alexander's last will and testament. In attendance were Isabella, looking pale and fragile, Clara, looking like a statue carved from ice and fury, and the heads of the three major charitable foundations that Alexander had passionately supported throughout his life. Arthur Kensington, his face a grim, stony mask that betrayed a deep and profound unease, cleared his throat and began. He explained, in his dry, precise, legalistic tone, that Alexander's previous and long-standing will, drafted 5 years prior, was a straightforward and well-considered document. The bulk of his vast fortune and his controlling shares in Nexus AI were to be placed in a professionally managed trust, with Clara as the lead trustee. The profits from this trust were to be split evenly between Clara and his three beloved charitable foundations. It was the will of a man deeply dedicated to his family and his philanthropic legacy. However, Kensington said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming heavy with a significance that made the air in the room feel thick and hard to breathe, a new will was filed with my office last week. It was not delivered by any of our usual trusted channels. It was delivered by a common messenger, and it came from the offices of Mrs. Sterling's personal attorney, an individual with whom this firm has had no prior contact. He produced a single, crisp sheet of heavy, cream-colored vellum. This document, which purports to be Alexander Sterling's final will and testament, is dated 3 days after the wedding. He continued, his sharp, intelligent gaze flicking briefly towards Isabella, who sat perfectly still, a look of sad, almost weary resignation on her beautiful face. This new will explicitly revokes all previous wills. It is, remarkably and in my professional opinion, shockingly simple. It leaves Alexander's entire estate, his personal fortune, his properties, his art collection, and, most critically, his controlling interest in Nexus AI entirely and unconditionally to his beloved wife, Isabella Sterling née Dubois. A collective, stunned, and horrified silence filled the room. The heads of the charities looked at each other in utter disbelief and panic. Clara Sterling simply stared at Isabella, her expression one of cold, murderous, and yet somehow vindicated fury. "That is impossible," Clara said, her voice dangerously, unnaturally calm. "Alexander would never have done that. He lived and breathed for his foundations. He would never, ever cut them out. And he would never sign over his entire life's work, his very soul, like that, 3 days after marrying a woman he barely knew. The document appears to be in perfect legal order." Isabella's lawyer, a slick, expensive-looking man named Marcus Thorne who had materialized at her side, interjected smoothly. "It is signed by Mr. Sterling and witnessed by 2 individuals, as required by law." "Arthur," Clara said, her attention fixed laser-like on the old family lawyer. "You've known Alexander his entire life. You've seen his signature on 1,000 documents, from childhood birthday cards to billion-dollar contracts. Is it his?" Arthur Kensington took off his gold-rimmed glasses and began to polish them slowly, meticulously, with a silk handkerchief, a gesture that everyone in the room recognized as his way of buying time to choose his words with surgical precision. He looked at the document, then at Isabella, then at Clara. "The signature," he said, his voice a low, careful rumble, "bears a remarkable, almost perfect resemblance to Alexander's. However, as a legal professional who has had the honor of serving this family for 40 years, it is my considered opinion that the timing, the content, and the very nature of this document are highly irregular. The witnesses, a Mr. John Smith and a Miss Jane Doe, are not known to me or to this firm, and there are subtle, almost microscopic inconsistencies in the penmanship, in the very flow and pressure of the ink, that I find deeply, profoundly troubling. As the executor of the estate, I have a fiduciary duty to ensure the absolute, unquestionable authenticity of this document. Therefore, I will be formally contesting its validity and submitting it for a full, independent forensic examination." It was a quiet, polite, and legally worded declaration of total war. Isabella's perfect composure finally irrevocably cracked. A flash of pure, venomous, and unrestrained anger lit her emerald eyes before being quickly, but not quickly enough, suppressed, replaced once again by the mask of the wounded, unfairly maligned widow. "This is an outrage," she whispered, her voice trembling with a practiced, convincing indignation. "My husband is barely cold in his grave, and his own sister is trying to poison you against me, to steal what my beloved Alexander wanted me to have." But the die was cast. Arthur Kensington's formal, legal challenge gave Detective Tanaka and his team the critical leverage they had been desperately seeking. The will was no longer a private, civil matter to be fought over by lawyers. It was now a potential and central piece of evidence in an active murder investigation. The original document was carefully sealed, logged, and transported to the police department's top forensic document examiner, a quiet, unassuming woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, who was a near legend in her field. For a week, she subjected the will to a battery of non-destructive tests under high-powered microscopes, infrared and ultraviolet light sources, and electrostatic detection apparatus. Simultaneously, Chan and Petrova, now armed with a broad and powerful warrant to look into Isabella Dubois's sealed and potentially fabricated records, launched a deep-dive investigation into her past. What they found was a ghost story. Her birth certificate was a sophisticated forgery. Her university degrees were from non-existent online institutions. They painstakingly, through digital forensics and old-fashioned detective work, discovered a series of previous, discarded identities, each one linked to a wealthy, older man who had either died under mysterious, accidental circumstances or had been financially and socially ruined shortly after meeting her. She was a professional black widow, a highly intelligent and patient predator who had honed her craft over a decade, culminating in her masterpiece: the seduction, marriage, and elimination of the biggest prize of all, Alexander Sterling. They also began to unravel the mystery of the witnesses to the will. John Smith and Jane Doe were, as expected, phantoms with no digital or legal footprint. But Chun, cross-referencing hours of grainy security footage from the public notary office where the will was officially stamped, found a possible match for Jane Doe. She was a small-time actress and known forger with a long criminal record, a woman with a rare, almost savant-like skill for mimicking handwriting. Financial records showed that she had been paid a substantial sum of money, wired from an untraceable offshore account, the day after the will was signed. While Chan and Petrova were chasing down the ghosts of Isabella's past, Tanaka was focused on the present, specifically on the scientific cause of Alexander's death. The initial toxicology reports had come back clean, showing no common poisons, illegal drugs, or alcohol. But driven by Clara's unshakable certainty and the now screaming billion-dollar motive of the will, Tanaka pushed the chief medical examiner for a more comprehensive and astronomically expensive battery of tests, specifically looking for rare, exotic, bioorganic toxins that would not be on any standard screening panel. "What are we looking for, exactly, Kaito?" the ME asked, his voice a mixture of professional curiosity and budgetary exasperation. "I don't know," Tanaka admitted, his voice quiet but firm. "But our suspect is a woman who curated a perfect, flawless life out of thin air. She wouldn't use something as common and clumsy as arsenic. Look for something elegant, something rare, something artistic." It was a long shot, a search for a single, unknown molecule in the vast, complex haystack of human biology. But Tanaka's instincts, honed over a lifetime of listening to the whispers of the dead, were screaming that the answer was there, hidden in the silent, waiting blood of Alexander Sterling. The pressure on Isabella was mounting, and for the first time in her long and successful career as a predator, she began to make small, almost imperceptible mistakes. Aware that she was under intense legal and financial scrutiny, she started liquidating some of Alexander's smaller, more easily accessible assets, moving millions of dollars through a complex, dizzying web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. These frantic, greedy, and ultimately premature movements were a bright, flashing red flag to the Financial Crimes Unit, who were now tracking her every digital transaction. The breakthroughs, when they finally came, happened almost simultaneously, a perfect, converging storm of forensic, digital, and financial evidence that would seal her fate. Dr. Sharma's final, definitive report on the will landed on Tanaka's desk. It was a masterpiece of forensic science, a document of cold, irrefutable fact. While the signature is a masterful, near-perfect forgery, one of the best I have ever encountered, she wrote in her conclusion. It is, without a shadow of a doubt, a forgery. The microscopic analysis of the ink pressure and flow shows minute, unnatural hesitations and pen lifts, consistent not with the fluid, unconscious, and ingrained muscle memory of a genuine signature, but with the slow, deliberate, and intense concentration of a forger drawing a shape. Furthermore, electrostatic detection analysis reveals clear, indented impressions on the page beneath the signature, suggesting the forger meticulously traced a genuine template. It is, in its own way, a work of art, but it is a forgery nonetheless. Tanaka had just finished reading the report for the second time when his phone rang. It was the chief medical examiner. His voice was filled with a mixture of professional excitement and profound, human horror. "You were right, Tanaka," he said, his voice a low, stunned whisper. "My God, you were right. We found it. It took a goddamn mass spectrometer and a comparison against a specialized botanical and marine toxicology database, but we found it. A massive, lethal dose of conotoxin, a highly potent and complex neurotoxin derived from the venom of a rare species of cone snail. It's incredibly rare, incredibly fast-acting. It would induce complete, almost instantaneous paralysis of the cardiac and respiratory muscles, perfectly mimicking the symptoms of a massive, sudden heart attack. It would be completely, utterly untraceable in a standard tox screen. This wasn't a heart attack, detective. This was one of the most sophisticated, elegant, and diabolical poisonings I have ever seen in my entire career." Tanaka hung up the phone, a cold, grim sense of triumph washing over him. He held the two reports in his hands. He now had irrefutable scientific proof of murder by a rare and exotic poison, and a clear, irrefutable billion-dollar motive in the form of a masterfully forged will. The unraveling was complete. The grieving, beautiful widow was a cold, calculating, and brilliant killer, and her perfect, flawless lie had just come crashing down. The decision to arrest Isabella Sterling was made in the cold, pre-dawn hours of a Thursday morning. It was a strategic move, a calculated decision designed to catch her at her most vulnerable, before her formidable army of high-priced lawyers was fully mobilized and could erect a wall of legal injunctions and procedural delays. The arrest warrant, citing the new, damning evidence from the toxicology and forensic document reports, was signed by a judge who had been following the case with a grim, almost personal fascination. The media, tipped off by a carefully calculated and anonymous leak from the district attorney's office, was already gathering like a flock of hungry vultures outside the imposing, wrought-iron gates of the Sterling country estate. Detective Tanaka, however, had a different plan. An arrest at her home, in the privacy of her grief-stricken sanctuary, was too predictable. It would allow her to control the narrative, to play the part of the grieving, innocent widow being cruelly, unjustly dragged from her home. Tanaka wanted to shatter her composure, to strip away the elegant, carefully maintained facade in a place where she felt utterly, completely, and unassailably in control. He learned, through a discreet source, that she was scheduled to give the keynote address at the annual Patrons of the Arts Gala that very evening. It was a high society, black-tie event where she would be the guest of honor, a symbol of resilience and philanthropic grace, that, he decided, would be their stage. The gala was held in the grand, marbled, and echo-filled atrium of the city's Museum of Modern Art. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the low, self-important hum of powerful people making powerful conversation. Isabella, a breathtaking vision in a floor-length, emerald green gown that perfectly matched her eyes, stood at the podium, a portrait of quiet strength and heartbreaking grace. She spoke eloquently, her voice a low, mesmerizing melody, of her late husband's passionate, lifelong devotion to the arts and of her solemn commitment to continuing his philanthropic legacy. The crowd of the city's wealthiest and most influential citizens was mesmerized, hanging on her every perfectly chosen word. As she finished her speech to a wave of thunderous, sustained applause, She looked out over the sea of adoring, upturned faces, and her eyes, sweeping the room, finally met those of Detective Kaito Tanaka. He was standing quietly, almost invisibly, at the back of the atrium, flanked by Detective Petrova and two uniformed officers, his presence a stark, brutal intrusion of reality into this world of fantasy and wealth. A flicker of something cold and sharp, not fear, but a flash of pure, unadulterated, and incandescent fury passed across her perfect features before being instantly, masterfully suppressed. The serene, sad smile remained fixed on her face as she gracefully descended the steps from the stage, moving not away from the detectives, but directly towards them, a queen preparing to address an unwelcome and impertinent delegation of peasants who had wandered into her court. "Detective Tanaka," she said, her voice a low, dangerous purr that was meant for him alone, but was sharp enough to cut glass. "You are ruining a perfectly lovely and important evening." "Isabella Sterling," Tanaka said, his voice calm, professional, and just loud enough for those in the immediate vicinity to hear, his words dropping into the celebratory atmosphere like stones into a still pond. "You are under arrest for the murder of your husband, Alexander Sterling." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. The self-important chatter died instantly, replaced by a thick, shocked silence. 100 expensive smartphones were raised, their camera lenses hungrily capturing the moment of the mighty's fall. Isabella's serene smile finally faltered, her face paling slightly as Petrova stepped forward and, with a quiet, almost apologetic, "Ma'am, please put your hands behind your back," placed her in cool, unyielding steel handcuffs. The sharp, metallic click of the cuffs was a shockingly loud, almost obscene sound that echoed in the cavernous, suddenly silent atrium. The facade had not just crumbled. It had been publicly, spectacularly, and irrevocably detonated. The interrogation began 2 hours later. Isabella, now changed into a drab, ill-fitting gray prison jumpsuit, sat across from Tanaka and Petrova in a small, windowless room of concrete and steel. Her high-powered lawyer, a man whose suit alone cost more than Petrova's car, sat beside her, whispering frantic instructions into her ear. She was a statue of cold, defiant, and utter silence, her face a blank mask, answering every question from the detectives with a curt, dismissive, "No comment." Tanaka began his own performance, laying out the evidence against her, piece by methodical, irrefutable piece, like a surgeon arranging his instruments on a sterile tray. He started with the toxicology report. "We found the conotoxin, Isabella, a rare, sophisticated, and incredibly difficult to acquire poison, almost impossible to trace. But our ME is a very persistent man. We found it." She remained silent, her expression one of utter, profound boredom, as if listening to a particularly dull and poorly presented university lecture. He moved on to her meticulously researched past, laying out a series of photographs on the table in front of her. They were of her previous, discarded identities, each one placed next to a photo of a wealthy, older man who had met a tragic or unfortunate end. "We know who you are, Isabella, or whatever your real name is," Petrova said softly, her voice a counterpoint to Tanaka's hard-edged professionalism. "We know what you've done. The pattern is undeniable." Isabella glanced at the photos, a flicker of genuine, dismissive contempt in her eyes. "My client will not be responding to these baseless, slanderous, and utterly fantastical accusations," her lawyer stated flatly, his voice full of practiced, professional outrage. Then Tanaka played his final and most powerful card. He slid the thick, detailed forensic report on the will across the table, its pages filled with magnified, color-coded images of her forged signature, charts detailing ink composition and paper analysis, and complex diagrams illustrating the unnatural, microscopic pen lifts and hesitations that had been her undoing. "This was your mistake," Tanaka said, his voice quiet but intense, leaning forward, his eyes locking with hers. "The murder was brilliant, I'll give you that. The new identity was masterful. The performance of the grieving widow was flawless. But this was hubris. This was arrogance. You believed you were so much smarter than everyone else that you could forge a man's soul, his entire life's legacy, with a simple pen. But a signature, Isabella. A signature is a habit. It's a lifetime of unconscious, ingrained muscle memory. And you, for all your brilliance, couldn't replicate it perfectly. Dr. Sharma found your hesitations. She found the ghost of the template you so carefully traced. In the ink, in the pressure on the paper, she found you. He tapped the report with his index finger, the sound a sharp, final punctuation mark in the silent room. This is not a theory. This is not a disgruntled sister's accusation. This is science. This is a mathematical certainty. You forged this will. And the only reason for a person to forge a will like this is if you knew, with absolute cold-blooded certainty, that the man who wrote the original was about to die. It was this final piece of evidence, this attack not on her morality but on her intelligence, on the perfection of her craft, that finally irrevocably broke her. Her lawyer began to speak, to object, but she held up a cuffed hand, silencing him with a sharp, dismissive gesture. She leaned forward, her emerald eyes, no longer serene, no longer grieving, now burning with a cold, reptilian, and utterly terrifying fire. He was a means to an end, detective, she said, her voice dropping its pretense of softness, revealing the hard, sharp, and ugly edges beneath. A brilliant but foolish, sentimental man. He had all the money, all the power in the world, and he didn't have the slightest idea what to do with it. He wanted to give it away to charity, to his shrew of a sister, to the ungrateful masses. A complete and utter waste. I was the only one who truly appreciated the beauty, the power of what he had built. I was the only one worthy of it. So you killed him for it? Tanaka stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I took what I was owed, she corrected him. A chilling, narcissistic pride ringing in her voice. The poison was perfect. The plan was perfect. My only mistake, she said, glancing at the forensic report with a look of genuine professional disgust, was underestimating the tedious, plodding competence of your little librarian. It was not a confession born of remorse or guilt, but a boast born of pure, unadulterated, and monstrous arrogance. It was the final, horrifying, and true piece of her long and masterful performance. The trial was a media circus, but the outcome was never in any real doubt. The crushing, scientific weight of the toxicology report combined with the irrefutably forged will was an open and shut case. Isabella Dubois, the Black Widow of Crestwood Hills, the woman who had charmed and conned her way through a life of luxury and death, was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Weeks later, Tanaka and Petrova stood in the quiet, cavernous evidence lockup, watching as the will, the poison reports, and the other artifacts of the case were boxed up and archived. In the end, Petrova said, her voice a soft echo in the silent room, for all her brilliance, all her meticulous planning, it all came down to a few shaky, microscopic lines on a single piece of paper. Tanaka nodded, his gaze distant. She thought she was creating a masterpiece, he said, a perfect, flawless crime. But she forgot the most basic, fundamental rule. You can't erase the truth. You can hide it, you can disguise it, but it always leaves a trace. A fingerprint, a drop of poison, or in her case, the ghost of a signature. He looked at the box, at the sum total of Isabella's vast ambition and insatiable greed. She had gotten the fortune she was willing to kill for, if only for a few, fleeting, and ultimately worthless weeks. But now all she had was a story, a dark and cautionary tale of a gilded vow that had ended, as all such vows built on a foundation of lies and murder eventually must, in a final, unassailable, and just judgment.